In the year 476, a teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus quietly handed over his crown, and the Western Roman Empire was declared dead. We're taught a barbarian warlord kicked down the gates and ended 1,000 years of Rome. But here's the part nobody tells you. By the time the barbarians arrived, Rome was already a corpse. They didn't kill the empire. They just signed the death certificate. You know the version from school. Hordes of fur-clad savages pour over the border. They sack the eternal city, burn the libraries, and drag civilization into 1,000 years of darkness. One dramatic invasion, and the lights go out. It's a clean, satisfying story. It's also almost completely wrong. So if it wasn't the barbarians, what actually killed the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? Start with one strange fact that breaks the whole barbarian theory in half. The very same barbarians who supposedly destroyed Rome had been living inside it for generations. They farmed Roman land. They paid Roman taxes. And most importantly, they made up a massive share of the Roman army itself. By the 5th century, the soldiers defending Rome and the invaders attacking it were often the same people. So the real question isn't why the barbarians were at the gates. It's why Rome could no longer keep them out. Think of the empire less like a fortress and more like a patient. A healthy Rome had shrugged off invasions for centuries. Hannibal marched elephants into Italy and Rome still won. Whole armies were annihilated, and Rome just built more. So when a few war bands finally pushed it over in the 400s, that's not the story of a strong body being murdered. That's the story of a sick one finally giving out. And the disease started long before any barbarian crossed the Rhine. The first thing to die wasn't the army, it was the money. For its first 2 centuries, a Roman silver coin, the denarius, was almost pure silver. It was trusted from Britain to Syria. It was, in a sense, the dollar of the ancient world. But emperors had a problem every government eventually faces. They needed more money than they had. So they did the easy thing. They started shaving the silver out of the coins, a little at a time, mix in cheap copper, keep the same face stamped on it, and pretend nothing changed. Under Nero, the denarius was around 90% silver. A century and a half later, under 50. By the mid-200s, barely 5%, dipped in a thin silver wash that rubbed off in your hand. Here's the problem. People aren't stupid. When the coin is worthless, prices explode. This is inflation. The same monster every modern economy still fears. Running wild 18 centuries ago, in Egypt, the price of wheat rose so violently over the 3rd century that it's measured not in percentages but in multiples, climbing many times over within a few generations. Soldiers demanded to be paid in actual goods because the coins were trash. Tax collectors stopped accepting the state's own currency. An empire runs on trust in its money. Rome had spent that trust down to nothing, and a broke empire can't do the one thing an empire must: defend itself. Stop and sit with that for a second. We picture Rome falling to swords and fire. But the deepest wound was something far more boring and far more deadly. A spreadsheet that no longer added up. You cannot pay legions with coins nobody trusts. You cannot maintain roads, walls, and fleets when the treasury is full of fake silver. The barbarians didn't need to break Rome's defenses. Rome could no longer afford them. Now the second killer. And this one Rome did entirely to itself. We imagine Roman legions standing guard on the frontier, watching for invaders. For long stretches of the 3rd century, they were doing the opposite. They were marching inward to fight each other because the throne had no rules. Rome never solved the simplest question a state can ask: who gets to be in charge next? There was no clear law of succession, so the answer became brutally simple: whoever the army backed. And the army learned a dangerous lesson. Make your general emperor, and he pays you. Generously. In about 50 years, Rome burned through more than 20 emperors. Most were murdered, often by their own troops.
They are everywhere.
This stretch is called the crisis of the 3rd century, and it nearly ended everything. 200 years before the official fall. Picture what that does to a country. Every few years, the most experienced soldiers in the empire stop guarding the border and turn around to fight a rival Roman army. Crops burn. Cities are sacked by Romans. The frontier is stripped bare exactly when enemies are pressing in. A barbarian raid was a problem. A civil war was a catastrophe. And Rome had dozens. The empire's deadliest enemy wasn't outside the walls, it was sitting on the throne. But while emperors were stabbing each other, something far quieter was draining the empire of the one thing it could never replace fast enough: people. Twice, plague swept across the Roman world. The first, under Marcus Aurelius, may have killed millions. The second, a century later, hit a population already weakened. And an empire is, at the end of the day, a numbers game. Fewer people meant fewer farmers to grow the grain. Fewer farmers meant less food and fewer taxes. Fewer taxpayers meant less money for the army. And fewer young men meant fewer soldiers on the wall. Every one of these feeds the others. Plague doesn't just kill people. It kills the entire system that turns people into power. Rome was bleeding out from the inside, and no sword had even been drawn. Notice what's happening here. We started looking for the one big villain, the barbarian at the gate. Instead, we keep finding internal rot, worthless money, endless civil war. A shrinking population. None of these makes a dramatic movie scene. But stacked together, they explain something the invasion story never can. Why Rome got weaker for 200 years before it finally fell. And the next killer is the one Rome built with its own ambition. At its height, Rome stretched from the rainy hills of Britain to the deserts of the Middle East. More than 70 million people, a frontier thousands of miles long. For a while, that size was Rome's superpower. But an empire that size has a hidden, fatal cost. Every mile of border has to be watched. Every distant province has to be supplied, garrisoned, and governed. Across roads that took weeks to travel, and the bigger you get, the more enemies you make. This is overextension. And it's the trap that catches almost every empire that has ever existed. The conquests that once flooded Rome with slaves and gold mostly stopped. The expansion ended, but the cost of holding everything never did. Now Rome had to defend a colossal perimeter with a shrinking population and worthless money against pressure building on every side at once. A strong, rich Rome could hold those borders forever. A broke, depopulated, war-torn Rome could not hold them anywhere. So Rome made a fateful decision. If the empire was too big for one man to defend, split the job. The empire was formally divided into west and east, each with its own emperor, court, and treasury. On paper, sensible management. In practice, it quietly sealed the West's fate. Because the two halves were not equal. The East held the rich ancient cities, Egypt's grain, the trade routes, the deep tax base. The wealth pooled there, in a new capital called Constantinople. The West was left poorer, more rural, and far harder to defend. And when the pressure came, the two halves often acted like rivals instead of one empire. The East would happily steer a barbarian threat westward, away from itself. The richer half survived, and would live on for another 1,000 years. The poorer half was left holding the longest, most dangerous borders with the emptiest treasury. Guess which one fell? Which brings us back to the army. And the final fatal twist. Rome was running out of its own citizens willing to serve. Plague had thinned them. The economy had gutted small farms that once raised tough recruits. Rich Romans bought their way out of service entirely. So Rome did the logical thing. If you can't find soldiers, you hire them. And here's the trap that closed on the empire. Rome increasingly filled its armies with the very barbarian peoples it was supposedly fighting. Hired as mercenaries, settled inside the borders, handed weapons and Roman pay. Whole tribes came in under their own leaders, loyal to those leaders first, Rome a distant second. So when the money ran dry and Rome stopped paying, which, with that broken economy, it always eventually did, the men holding the spears were under no illusion they owed Rome anything. The empire had outsourced its own survival to people who had no reason to die for it. Now go back to that famous date, 476, the fall of Rome. The man who deposed the last Western emperor, Odoacer, wasn't some alien horde from the forest. He was a commander of Rome's own Germanic soldiers. His men wanted land and pay Rome could no longer give. So he removed a powerless boy emperor and ruled Italy himself. He didn't even bother to claim the title of emperor. Why would he? The office was already meaningless. He just turned off the lights in a building everyone had already abandoned. And here's the part that really breaks the myth. In the East, Rome didn't fall at all. Constantinople kept calling itself the Roman Empire and survived for nearly another 1,000 years. So, the fall of Rome wasn't a death. It was a slow unraveling in one half of a divided state after 2 centuries of self-inflicted decay. The barbarians weren't the cause. They were the symptom. The thing that walks through a door that careless hands left wide open. So why does this matter 1,800 years later? Because the way Rome actually died is far more unsettling than the way we're taught. It wasn't beaten by a stronger enemy. It debased its own currency until trust collapsed. It tore itself apart over power. It hollowed out its own people and outsourced its own defense. The barbarians barely had to push. Empires rarely die from a single dramatic blow. They rot quietly from the inside, while everyone keeps pointing at the enemy outside the wall. That's the part Rome can still teach us. The barbarians got the blame for 2,000 years. The truth is, Rome handed them an empire that was already broke, already divided, and already defended by men who no longer cared. So here's my question. Of all of it, the money, the civil wars, the plague, the split, the mercenaries, which one do you think really pushed Rome over the edge? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe, because at Empire Archives, we don't just tell you that empires fall. We trace exactly how and why the greatest powers in history rot from within.